Hi friends. Tonight, let us travel back through the soft corridors of time to an era not cloaked in fairy tales, but one rooted in the raw dust and aching dreams of those who chased fleeting glimmers of gold. We begin not with wealth nor splendor, but with a boy, no richer than his neighbors, no wiser than the age into which he was born, who set his heart westward, upon a path forged by hope and worn by sorrow. His name was Elijah Ward, and the year was 1849. In a quiet valley of Missouri, where the sun rose gently over fields tamed by generations of toil, Elijah lived with his family in a small cabin built by his grandfather's hands. The land was old, and so was the struggle. Winter had stripped their fields bare the past 2 years, and the price of corn had fallen low. His father, John Ward, once a proud farmer, now walked with a limp from a broken leg that healed poorly after an accident. With the plough mule, his mother, Miriam, still sang hymns at dusk, but her eyes carried a weariness that even music could not ease. It was early spring when the whispers first reached them, tales of gold dust scooped from riverbeds in California, of ordinary men striking fortune in the space of a morning. The newspapers called it a new Eden. Letters from distant cousins spoke of hills shining in the sun, of tents blooming in the wilderness like wildflowers, of fortunes staked and won with nothing more than a shovel and hope. Elijah was just 22. His hair was the color of dried hay, his boots stitched with patches, and his palms bore the memory of 1,000 mornings spent tilling soil that yielded little but calluses. But his heart stirred like the prairie wind at the mention of gold. He saw not just coins, but redemption, the chance to buy back the family's old land, to heal his father's pride, to offer his mother rest. The morning he left was quiet. No grand farewells, no crowd to cheer him on. Just mist hanging low across the barley fields and the slow creak of the barn door swinging shut. His mother gave him a bundle wrapped in linen, bread, smoked pork, and a dried apple tart. His sister Anna, shy and 12, handed him a handkerchief she'd embroidered with his initials. His father, gruff and wordless, placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and pressed into it a small pocket watch, once his own father's, and said only, "Don't follow gold so far you lose yourself, son." And then Elijah walked. He joined a caravan heading westward, a long, lumbering procession of wagons, oxen, and men with wild eyes and borrowed dreams. There were veterans of the Mexican War, German immigrants, and farm boys just like him. They shared tents, sang around the fire, and made bold promises to return rich. The road was dusty, endless, and loud with the crack of whips and the groaning of wooden wheels. At first, it felt like a story he was stepping into. Prairie stretched wide like God's own canvas. At night, the stars hung low and brilliant, and Elijah often found himself scribbling thoughts into a leather-bound journal, a gift from the local school teacher. Day 5. The prairie glows silver under the moon. I wonder if the rivers in California truly sparkle with gold, or only with reflection. They passed Fort Kearny by mid-May. Prices there were steep, $1 for a tin of beans, $15 for a mule. Elijah traded the pocket watch for a box of nails, a kettle, and a pair of sturdy new boots. He didn't regret it. Not yet. Sickness came next. A fever swept through their party 2 weeks later. Typhoid, they thought. 3 men died within days. No proper burials, just graves dug shallow beneath the cottonwoods. The wind carried prayers that were more silence than speech. Elijah watched as one of the men's hats blew away into the tall grass and thought how even belongings seemed eager to leave the dead behind. But still, they pressed on, because behind every hardship loomed the dream, California. Crossing the Rockies was a cruel baptism. Snow choked the mountain passes even in June. Mules slipped. A woman named Clara lost her child to the cold, and the sound of her crying echoed through the timberline like something broken in the world itself. When Elijah finally stepped into California, the land did not greet him with gold. It greeted him with dust, sun, and a sky that seemed too wide for any man to own. He arrived in Hangtown, a muddy, hastily built settlement crammed with tents, shacks, and saloons. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the clamour of hundreds of pickaxes hitting stone. There was no laughter, only eyes dulled by fatigue and hands that moved like machines. Elijah found a patch of land beside the river, claimed it with a wooden sign, and began to pan. At first, nothing. Mud, pebbles, flecks of pyrite, fool's gold. But sometimes, just sometimes, a glimmer appeared, just enough to tease, just enough to stay. He wrote again that night. There's something here. I saw it catch the light. Gold or not, it felt real. I'll keep digging. And so he did. For now, Elijah still believed. The rivers shimmered, even if only in his mind. The journey was only beginning. But what lay ahead, what the gold would cost? No whisper had warned him of that. The sun rose later now, casting soft pink veils across the foggy pines that loomed around the camp. Elijah was up before the light, as he was each day, his breath fogging in the cold air, his fingers numb but still reaching for his pan. His tent. Little, more than canvas stitched with hope and patched with yesterday's failures, offered little shelter from the chill. He no longer cared. The river was waiting. His days were a rhythm of scooping, swirling and sorting, again and again, pan after pan. The motion became muscle memory, but not once did the labour grow lighter. Water soaked his boots and seeped into his bones. Blisters bloomed and broke. His hands, once smooth like the language of his mother's, lullabies, now resembled the bark of old trees, cracked, ridged, and deeply lined. And all the while, the gold eluded him. Not entirely, of course. There were glimmers, small flakes that danced in the sun like tiny promises. But they were inconsistent, fleeting. Each pan might hold the potential for hope or disappointment, but rarely anything in between. The other miners were not faring, much better. Elijah had expected camaraderie, a band of dreamers perhaps, united in toil. Instead, he found only silence and suspicion. Each man guarded his claim with the fierceness of a starving dog. Accusations flew over mere inches of riverbed. Tools disappeared. So did rations. One morning, Elijah woke to find his mule gone. The rope still tied neatly around the post, swaying in the breeze, but no hoofprints, no sound, no sign of struggle. The animal was simply taken. He spent the day searching, asked every miner he passed. Some gave shrugs, others only narrowed their eyes. One man, a leathery trapper with one ear and no teeth, simply spat on the ground and said, "Animals don't last long here, neither do men." The mule had carried everything, supplies, tools, the last of his food. Now, Elijah was left to bear his burdens alone. He made 4 trips that day, just to haul a sack of river silt up the slope, his shoulders screaming with each step. His reward, 2 tiny flakes of gold, no larger than breadcrumbs. That night, with the wind howling like wolves through the black pine trees, he sat beside a dying fire with Jedediah Black, the Virginian schoolteacher turned miner, whose flask seemed to hold more poetry than whiskey. They shared a tin of cold beans, laughing faintly between mouthfuls. "Stole your mule, did they?" Jed asked. Elijah nodded. "Guess it's my own fault, trusting rope more than people." Jed leaned back, staring at the stars. "In Virginia, I taught Homer to boys who had never left their father's porches. We read of Odysseus, of Troy, of men chasing glory across oceans. I never told them that glory comes with blisters." "I never read Homer," Elijah murmured. "Just scripture and seed catalogues." "You're better off," Jed said with a dry smile. "At least the seed catalogue might offer something you can eat." The next morning, the first snow arrived. Not heavy, but enough to mute the sound of footsteps and soften the rage of the river. Elijah's hands were stiff with cold. His coat, traded weeks ago for a new pan and a bag of oats, was gone. He, layered burlap sacks over his shirt, and tied rags around his ankles. At the river, he watched a man curse at the current and hurl his shovel into the woods. Another knelt in silence, panning without movement, eyes blank. Elijah wondered if the man had found something, or lost something too heavy to speak of. Violence came next, not like thunder, but like rot, slow and unannounced. Two men claimed the same stretch of river. One insisted he had marked it with stakes. The other swore he'd been there for weeks. Words turned sharp, then a fist, then a knife. Blood ran into the silt. The camp didn't pause. No authorities came. A few men dragged the body into the trees and said a half prayer. The murderer vanished by nightfall. Elijah couldn't sleep that night. Not from fear exactly, but from the gnawing knowledge that gold, so small, so trivial in weight, could turn men to beasts. He wrote in his journal by candlelight, his script shaky and tired. The river doesn't lie. We just ask the wrong questions. It tells us only what we want to hear, that if we suffer long enough, it will reward us. But so far, all it's given me is mud and ghosts. A week passed. Elijah's shovel broke, splintered clean in two as he tried to pry loose a stone. He borrowed Jed's, though the head was rusting and the handle wrapped in twine. Each swing sent shock through his arms. One evening, by some miracle or mockery, he found it, a nugget, not dust, not flake, a nugget the size of a thimble. It rested at the bottom of his pan like a single word at the end of a long, desperate sentence. His hands shook, his breath caught. For a moment, he was a boy again, running barefoot in summer fields. He rushed to town, exchanged it for coins, less than he imagined, but enough to buy bread, whiskey, and a new blanket. He returned to the fire that night, warmth in his chest for the first time in weeks. He and Jed sang a hymn they barely remembered, voices cracking in the dry wind. But as Elijah laid beneath the stars, the nugget already spent, he whispered into the dark, "It's not enough. It's never enough." The days fell into rhythm again, not by choice, but by necessity. The kind of rhythm found in chain gangs or factory lines. Elijah rose with the dawn, shoulders stiff, breath visible in the morning chill. His new blanket offered comfort, but not rest. The air in camp had grown heavier somehow, not just with smoke or the scent of unwashed bodies, but with something invisible and far more exhausting: despair. The gold rush was slowing. Rumours crept in from the south. Miners returning from Sutter's Mill said the riverbeds had been picked clean. Others claimed that bands of vigilantes were beginning to take claims by force. But the worst news, the most difficult to silence, was the simplest. There was less. Gold now, and more men chasing it. Elijah tried to ignore the rumours. Each day, he walked the familiar trail to his claim, shovel in hand, back sore, but resolute. He no longer expected riches, but perhaps, just perhaps, he might find enough to survive. The earth had other plans. By late October, the ground had hardened. The soft summer soil was now brittle and dry. What once yielded under his boots now cracked, stubborn as an old mule. Elijah dug deeper, striking rocks with every swing. Dust rose in thick clouds around him, clinging to his skin, his lashes, the back of his throat. He began to cough. At first it was dry and shallow, a tickle, nothing more. But within a week, the cough turned rough, scraping his chest like sandpaper. His lungs wheezed in the cold mornings. He'd sit by the fire, hunched forward, hacking into a cloth stained faintly with red. Jed watched him in silence, offering tea brewed from wild sage. "They call it miner's lung," the older man said one night. "From the dust, gets into you, won't come out." Elijah smiled weakly. "Better than dying broke, I guess." Jed didn't laugh. The riverbank had begun to shift. Where there were once 10 miners along the edge, now stood 50. Each man staked a claim with more desperation than legality. Disputes grew more frequent, and fists were replaced by pistols. Elijah learned to keep his head down. He marked his claim with extra stones and placed his journal in a tin box buried beside the tent in case someone came while he was gone. By November, food had grown scarce again. Supply wagons stopped arriving as often. The roads were less safe now, threatened by bandits and early snows. Elijah and Jed survived on biscuits, onions, and whatever meat they could barter from passing traders. One week, they purchased a squirrel from a boy with trembling hands. Another, they shared a pigeon Jed had shot and plucked himself. Their tent, though patched and sagging, had become a kind of sanctuary. At night, they spoke softly. Of home, of childhoods long gone. Jed spoke of a woman he once planned to marry, before the war, before the gold. Elijah, more hesitant, spoke of a creek behind his family's barn, where he and his sister once floated leaves like ships in spring floods. Neither of them mentioned the future. One morning, Elijah rose to find frost covering his tools. The shovel's metal glittered like it had been dipped in silver. He gripped it anyway, ignoring the pain in his fingers. The work had to continue, always. But that day, something was different. The river was quiet, too quiet. The usual clamour of pans and pickaxes was gone. As he approached his claim, he saw a group of men huddled around a stump. They parted slowly as he arrived, their faces pale. Lying there, curled like a question mark, was the body of a miner Elijah had spoken to, just days before, a Swedish man named Otto who always whistled while he worked. Now his lips were blue, his eyes open but unseeing. In his hand, clenched tight even in death, was a small golden flake. No one knew what had happened. Some said it was fever, others, poison. A few suspected murder. The group buried Otto on a hill overlooking the river. No cross, just stones. Elijah watched the soil fall and felt the cough return. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Gold will bury more men than it ever feeds." Jed had grown quieter. His hands shook more often. The cold had begun to affect his mind. He spoke in fragments, reciting poems Elijah didn't recognize. Once, Elijah found him sitting in the dark, whispering to a bundle of firewood as if it were a child. Winter came early. Snow dusted the camp like powdered sugar, deceptively beautiful. Elijah wrapped rags around his feet and walked slower, his shovel, worn and dull, barely cut into the frozen earth, but he kept digging. One evening, as dusk bled across the horizon, he found another nugget, smaller than the first, but heavier than anything he'd lifted that week. He turned it in, his palm, heart aching with quiet joy. He took it to the trading post, exchanged it for a wool scarf, dried meat, and a single orange. It had been months since he'd tasted fruit. He saved the orange for Jed, placed it beside his bedroll with a note written on torn parchment. "You once told me peace was wealth. I think today I bought a little peace for you." But Jed never woke. The cold had taken him some time in the night. There was no struggle, no noise, just stillness. Elijah buried him near Otto, beneath a pine tree that bowed gently in the winter wind. He left the orange by the grave. The next morning, he returned to the river and dug. Yet still, Elijah dug. He no longer chased fortune. Not really. The gold now felt less like treasure and more like a toll, a tax he paid to keep moving, to keep breathing. But he had learned something about grief. It needs motion. Stillness is where the sorrow deepens, where the weight settles. So Elijah chose movement. He chose the shovel. The days that followed Jed's burial were colder, quieter. Elijah began working farther upriver, where the trees leaned over the bank like old sentinels. Fewer miners worked there. It was harder, the gravel thicker, the ground meaner. But it also gave him space to remember. space to forget. One morning, while prying loose a stubborn stone, he heard voices behind him, sharp, clipped, and unfamiliar. He turned to find 3 men watching him, their faces hard, unreadable. They wore thick coats and wide-brimmed hats pulled low. Pistols hung at their hips, not casually, but as declarations. The leader, a man with deep-set eyes and a scar that curved like a hook from lip to ear, stepped forward. "This here's our stretch," he said, not loudly, but with the certainty of someone who expected no argument. "Been staked a month now." Elijah glanced at the markers he himself had placed weeks ago, stones arranged in the old miner's code. They were still there, untouched. "I've worked this claim since October," he replied, voice calm but tight. The man's eyes narrowed. "Then you've worked it long enough." There was a pause, brief but heavy. Elijah saw what he needed to see. The men weren't interested in gold. They wanted control, territory, power in a place that had no law. He didn't argue. He simply gathered his tools and walked. Behind him, one of the men spat into the snow. He found a new spot by dusk, less promising, more exposed, but at least quiet. He pitched his tent between 2 leaning cedars and boiled a pot of weak broth with the last of his salt pork. That night, he didn't write in his journal. He stared at the fire until the wood turned to ash. By the week's end, Elijah noticed something strange in camp. Fewer familiar faces. Men who had shared stew and stories only a month ago were now gone. Their tents collapsed, their tools scattered, their names whispered only in passing. The newcomers, the ones with hard eyes, had grown in number. They moved through the camp in quiet formation, taking over claims, offering no explanations. Some men resisted, most didn't. One afternoon, Elijah watched from the ridge as a miner refused to leave his patch. He was old, slow-moving, beard, white, with frost. 3 of the newcomers approached. There was no shouting, no drama, just a single blow with the butt of a rifle, and the man crumpled into the snow. When Elijah returned hours later, the old man's tent was gone. So was the body. The silence that followed spread like fog. No one asked questions. No one wanted to be next. Elijah wrote in his journal that night, "Greed does not roar. It creeps. It smiles. It thanks you for your time, and then takes everything you have." He began hiding his gold now. Not much, just flakes and dust, stored in a rusted tobacco tin buried beneath his bedroll. The idea of carrying it to town made him uneasy. Too many eyes, too many reasons to disappear on the way. The nights grew colder still. Wolves howled in the distance. Once, Elijah woke to find bear tracks in the snow near his tent. He tied a bell to the flap, but it offered little comfort. Each day he worked slower, not from laziness, but exhaustion. The cough had returned, deeper now, and sometimes brought blood. His hands shook when he tried to boil water. He dropped his pan twice in one morning. Still, he worked. Then one evening near dusk, he found something that stopped him cold. It was a hand, pale, frozen, jutting from a snowdrift like a forgotten root. Elijah knelt slowly, cleared away the frost. A face emerged. A young man, no older than himself, eyes shut, lips blue, no wounds, no sign of struggle, just stillness. He searched the pockets gently. No coins, no food, just a folded scrap of paper, soaked and barely legible. "Tell Anna I almost made it." That night, Elijah stared at the stars and whispered the name aloud. Anna. Just to keep it real. Just to let it live a little longer in the world. The camp had changed, utterly. Greed had stripped it not just of mercy, but of memory. No one mourned. No one buried. The dead became as common as the rocks. And yet Elijah remained. He stayed not because he believed anymore, but because he knew nothing else. The world behind him, Missouri, the farm, the creek with paper boats, felt like another life. another man's memory. He told himself he'd leave in the spring, after the thaw, after one more try, just one more. But deep down, he wasn't sure. He believed himself. The gold was no longer treasure. It was company, a quiet voice at the bottom of each pan, reminding him that he still existed, that his hands, however battered, could still create something from the earth, even if it wasn't enough, even if it never would be. And so, winter deepened. Snow fell like the ashes of forgotten dreams, blanketing the hills, muffling the screams, and quieting even the wolves. It lay thick across the paths between tents, softened the riverbank, and painted each pine in sorrow. The sky had turned to slate, and each sunrise seemed more reluctant than the last. Elijah remained. He was thinner now, his cheeks hollowed beneath the shadow of a beard he had stopped trimming. His hands were bandaged with rags, his breath wheezed from the cough that had become his companion. But it was not death that frightened him. It was silence. The camp had thinned. Many miners had left, those with wagons, horses, or enough sense to abandon the illusion of gold before it bled them dry. Others had vanished without a word, their tents left behind, flapping in the wind like empty sails. Elijah dug less now. The ground was iron, frozen deep and cruel. He spent most days gathering wood, boiling pine needles for tea, or trying to repair the leak in his tent's canvas roof. His gold tin was almost empty again. Then, one evening, he saw smoke rising from the hills, thick, black, roiling upward in columns. Not from a campfire, but from something larger, hotter. He climbed a ridge to see better, boots crunching in the snow, breath shallow from the effort. What he saw on the other side made his stomach tighten. An entire cluster of tents had caught fire, flames devouring canvas, leaping from one corner of the camp to the next, like wolves set loose in a pen. Men were running, shouting, throwing, snow or blankets, but it was useless. The blaze moved too fast, fed by months of dry pine needles, by desperation and spilled oil. Elijah recognized one of the camps. It had belonged to the group of newcomers, the ones with the scar-faced leader. He couldn't see him now. Only silhouettes against flame, chaotic and frantic. He stood on the ridge until the fire died to embers, until the shouting faded. Then he returned to his tent, made tea, and watched the trees sway in the wind. The next morning, he walked toward the remains. The snow was black with soot. Ash coated the river rocks like winter's shadow. 5 bodies had been pulled from the ruin, charred beyond recognition. Others were missing. Elijah didn't speak to anyone. No one spoke to him. They were all ghosts now. Men walking quietly through smoke, their gold dreams turned to cinders. Among the wreckage, he found a burned journal, the cover gone, the pages curled, but inside, in a spidery hand, a single sentence remained legible. We lit the fire to scare them. We didn't mean for it to take everything. He folded the page, placed it into his own journal, and walked away. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the valley like a voice from some older, colder world. Elijah's tent shook. He added extra stones around the edges and huddled near the fire. Sleep came in fits, short, haunted, filled with fevered dreams. In one dream, he saw Jed again, alive, smiling faintly. "They're digging in the wrong place," Jed whispered. "Who?" Elijah asked. "All of us," the teacher said, then turned and vanished into snow. When Elijah woke, his cheeks were wet with tears he didn't remember crying. Food was nearly gone. He hadn't panned in days. The tin of gold flakes sat untouched beneath his blanket, now lighter than ever. He debated eating the leather strap from his pack, remembered a story Jed once told about soldiers in winter. Then came the rider. Just after dawn, hoofbeats echoed across the frost. A single horse. The animal moved slow, its rider wrapped in layers of buffalo hide and wool. A long rifle hung from the saddle. The man didn't speak. He dismounted, stepped into the ruins of the burned camp, and studied the wreckage. Elijah watched from the trees. The rider stayed for hours, silent. He touched no bodies, took nothing, left no mark. Then he mounted again and rode northward, disappearing into the pines. Elijah returned to his tent and wrote, "Some come to find gold. Others come to count the cost." It was mid-December now. Elijah marked the days by the melting wax of his candles. He had 5 left, enough to last maybe until the thaw. If not, he would burn his journal for light. But one morning, the sky changed. Instead of the usual grey, it was clear, a cold, brilliant blue that seemed to sing above the peaks. The river, though mostly frozen, shimmered where sunlight touched its narrow veins. Birds returned, just 2, perched on a branch above his tent. He sat outside, wrapped in every layer he owned, and listened. Not to gold, not to men, but to the sound of winter loosening its grip. Hope didn't come in a blaze. It came in breath, in birdsong, in the slow drip of melting snow. That evening, he opened his journal to the last page and wrote, "I have almost nothing left, but I am still here." And maybe that too is gold. Elijah began to dream again. Not the wild, restless dreams of fever, but soft flickers, images of Missouri, of home, his mother hanging laundry beneath the pear tree, his sister, Anna, drawing stars in the dirt with a stick, the way the front dolt creaked just before supper. These memories came not like storms, but like rain, quiet, steady, inescapable. He began writing letters he never planned to send. He tore pages from his journal, those already filled with gold tallies and ash-stained, poems, and wrote on their backs. Each letter began the same way. "Dearest mother, I am still alive." It was the truth, and it was all he could offer. What followed was often more difficult. There were no stories of success, no riches to report. So he wrote about the snow, about Jed, about the river and the strange blue light that sometimes danced across the ice at dawn. He wrote to his sister too. "Anna, you would hate it here. The mud swallows your shoes and the bread tastes like stone. But I found a pine cone yesterday that looked like a rose, and I thought of you." Sometimes the letters were confessions. Sometimes apologies. Other times he simply listed things he missed. Warm milk, honey on cornbread, the sound of frogs in spring. He folded each one carefully, tied them with string, and placed them in a tin, along with the tobacco and the gold flakes. It became his, new treasure, not of wealth, but of memory, of something he was still trying not to lose. The camp remained silent. The fire from weeks ago had driven away what few had stayed. Elijah rarely saw other miners now. Those he did encounter spoke little, moved quickly, and avoided eye contact. There was no camaraderie left, only endurance. He scavenged what he could, melted snow for water, used pine sap to seal the holes in his boots. He even found a rusted coffee tin beneath a collapsed tent, filled with dried beans so old they tasted like ash, but they filled the hunger in his belly. Then came the night of the storm. The sky cracked, open without warning, lightning over snow, thunder rolling through the valley like a curse. The wind tore at Elijah's tent, snapping rope and sending ash flying from the fire. He held the canvas down with his body, teeth clenched, eyes shut tight. By morning, half his shelter was gone. He found it tangled in a tree 50 yards away, shredded. His bedroll was soaked, the gold tin missing. Panic set in. He searched the snow for hours, digging with bare hands, coughing blood into the ice. Finally, near a fallen branch, he found it. Dented, the lid slightly ajar, but intact. Inside, the gold flakes still glimmered faintly, and the letters were dry. He sat down in the snow and laughed, not with joy, but with something stranger, Relief, grief, perhaps even madness, but it passed, like the storm. He rebuilt the tent with pieces of canvas from nearby ruins. It leaned crookedly now, but it stood, and that was enough. The thaw continued. Day by day, the snow pulled back from the river's edge, revealing earth that had not been seen in months. Elijah returned to Panning, not with hope, but habit. The river felt different now, colder, wiser. He spoke to it sometimes, softly. Just a flake today, old friend. That's all I ask. He often found nothing, but every so often the water relented, a glint in the pan, a whisper in the current, and still he stayed. One morning, while gathering wood, he heard the creak of wagon wheels. He froze behind a tree, heart pounding. Not fear exactly, but a kind of disbelief. He hadn't heard wheels in weeks. The wagon came slowly, pulled by a pair of oxen, driven by a man with snow-white eyebrows and a face like dried leather. A young woman sat beside him, wrapped in shawls, her eyes wide with fatigue. They stopped by the river, not 20 yards from Elijah's tent. The man climbed down, stretched his back, and began unpacking crates. Elijah approached cautiously. "You, heading north?" he asked. The man turned. His voice was rough, but not unkind. Maybe south. Depends on the road. Snow's too thick in the passes." The young woman said nothing, only watched Elijah with cautious curiosity. He nodded toward their wagon. "You trade?" "Some. Beans, lard, flour. You got gold?" "Some." They bartered quietly. Elijah gave up one nugget and a half pouch of flakes for flour, matches, and a slab of salt pork. He hesitated, then added one of his letters to the trade. "Can you post this?" he asked the woman, his voice almost breaking. "To Missouri, for my mother." She took the letter gently. "We'll try." And that night, for the first time in months, Elijah lit a new fire, not just for warmth, but for comfort. He cooked a small meal with flour and pork. He wrapped his hands around a tin cup of tea, and he felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Not hope, not yet, but something like it. He opened his journal and wrote, "Today I gave away a piece of myself, not gold, but something far more rare, a memory, a truth. If it reaches her, she will know I still breathe, and maybe that will be enough." Outside, the wind had stilled. The fire crackled, and Elijah, for the first time in a long while, slept without dreams. They were disappearing, one by one. He first noticed it when he went to check the southern ridge, where a group of young miners had built a small ring of tents and fashioned a crude table from driftwood. Elijah used to hear them laughing at night, playing dice, singing songs in broken harmony. They were younger than most, barely men really, faces still round with youth and eyes that had not yet learned to lower. They were called the Ridge Boys by the rest of camp. No one knew where they came from exactly. One had a southern drawl, another spoke in sharp Boston syllables. They were always together, digging, cooking, sometimes fishing near the ice-cracked banks. They shared everything. And then, one morning, they were gone. No fire, no smoke, no prints in the snow. Their tents stood open, empty, as if they'd simply stepped away for a moment, but they never returned. Their tools lay undisturbed. Half a pot of beans froze beside the fire pit. A tin plate was still marked with fork scratches. Elijah stood, among their things, the silence ringing louder than any storm. He waited 2 days, then 3. Nothing. On the 4th day, he buried their remaining supplies. Carefully, respectfully. He whispered no prayers. He didn't know what gods they might have followed, but he placed a circle of stones at the entrance of each tent. A marker, a question, a wound. He returned to his own camp quieted, a heavy stillness in his chest. That night, he could not eat. He wrote in his journal, There's a kind of silence that doesn't belong to the world. It belongs to absence, the kind that follows a story cut off mid-sentence. The Ridge Boys weren't the last. A few days later, Elijah crossed paths with an old Welshman named Bryn, who had camped for weeks near the bend of the river. Bryn was talkative, fond of humming hymns as he worked, and had once shared a flask of plum brandy with Elijah on Christmas Eve. But now, Bryn's fire was cold, his tent torn. The canvas flapped softly like mourning cloth in the wind. His tools were gone. No sign of struggle, no blood, just emptiness. Elijah searched for tracks, but the ground was still too frozen, the snow too windswept. He sat in Bryn's spot for a while, stared out across the river. No answers came. Some began to whisper about wolves, others said bandits, ghost riders from the south, raiding isolated camps, taking whatever they pleased. But Elijah saw no evidence, no footprints, no sounds in the night, just disappearances. He considered leaving. He had enough gold, perhaps, to barter for a seat on a northbound wagon, if one passed. He had a few supplies, a repaired pack, and the will to walk, but something kept him there. Perhaps it was duty, or fear, or just stubbornness. Or perhaps he still believed someone needed to remember the names of the lost. He began carving names into stone. Each time someone vanished, Elijah would collect a smooth river rock, scratch their name, or what he knew of it, into the surface with a rusted nail, and leave it on a shelf of stone behind his tent. The Ridge Boys had 4, Bryn had 1. Others followed. Sometimes the names were whole. Sometimes they were only fragments. Thomas from the south, old man with the silver pipe, kid who sang Shenandoah. Each rock was placed with care. He spoke their names aloud as he set them down, as if that act alone might keep them tethered to the world a little, longer. By early February, Elijah's stone shelf held 16 names. One morning, while collecting firewood, Elijah spotted something strange near the edge of the woods. A shape between the trees, hunched and unmoving. He crept closer, heart hammering. It was a boy. Or rather, it had been. No more than 17. His face pale with frostbite, fingers blue and stiff, eyes wide open in terror. Elijah knelt, gently brushing snow from the boy's chest. He had no coat, no boots, only a scrap of paper tucked inside his shirt. It read, "Didn't know which way was safe." Elijah buried him beneath a cedar tree, used his last candle to melt the earth enough for a shallow grave. He placed a single stone at the head. Unknown, lost. And that night, the stars seemed colder than they ever had before. He wrote in his journal, "Out here, names disappear faster than bodies, and if we stop speaking them, then they are truly gone." The next morning, Elijah woke before the sun. He dressed slowly, drank the last of his pine tea, and walked to the river. He carried no shovel, no pan, just a letter. He unfolded it by the water's edge, hands trembling, and read it aloud to the current. "Dear Anna, I don't know if you ever got my first letter, or if this one will find you, but I want you to know something. I'm still here, not whole, not gold rich, but here. I've seen more vanish than stay. I've buried boys who never saw 20, but I remember them. I say their names. That has to count for something." He paused. The water shimmered faintly, ice breaking in soft clicks downstream. Then he folded the letter, placed it in a glass jar he'd found near the Ridge Boys' camp, sealed it with wax, and let it float downstream. The river accepted it without judgment. He watched it drift until it vanished from view. And then, quietly, he whispered, "Let someone remember." And into that hunger came merchants. They arrived not with shovels or pans, but with wagons heavy with things. Flour, boots, pickaxes, ropes, oil lamps, cans of salted beans. Goods that promise survival. Goods that whispered wealth is just a few dollars away. They dressed finer than the miners, wore wide hats and waistcoats with polished buttons, and their hands bore no calluses. Elijah watched them from a distance at first, wary. He had seen men vanish in silence, but these newcomers, these peddlers of goods and dreams, spoke too much. They haggled loudly, told stories even louder, and always smiled with too many teeth. One merchant set up shop near the river's bend, under a faded canvas tent marked in bold letters, Elkins and Sons, supplies for success. Inside, barrels of nails sat beside pickaxes too shiny to have touched dirt. Blankets stitched with colourful patterns were folded neatly atop crates of flour labelled Premium Eastern Milled. A bell rang each time a new customer entered. Elijah visited only once after running out of salt. He stepped inside, blinking against the lamplight and the scent of tobacco. The man behind the counter was tall, clean-shaven, and wore gloves despite the heat. "What can I help you with, friend?" he asked, with the smooth drawl of a stage actor. "Salt," Elijah replied simply. The man smiled. 10 cents an ounce. Elijah blinked. "That's robbery." "It's demand," the merchant said, "and you, sir, are desperate." He wasn't wrong. Elijah paid the coins and left. Outside, he heard another merchant pitch his wares to a weary miner. "Don't waste your time digging like a mole." "What you need is intel. For just $1, I've got a map, hand-drawn, of a valley 2 days' walk west. Untouched. Gold in the very dirt, I swear it." The miner hesitated, clutched the dollar in his hand like a question. Elijah didn't wait to see what he chose. That night by his fire he opened his journal. Some dig for gold, others dig in the hearts of the desperate. The next day, more wagons came. One bore a sign that read, "Boomtown Brews and Supplies." It offered whiskey at prices fit for kings and gunpowder beside peppermint sticks. Music played from a hand-cranked box, while a boy no older than 12 danced for coins on a broken crate. Men gathered like moths to flame. The merchant smiled, counted coins, and told stories of gold strikes just over the ridge, of hidden caves filled with nuggets, of a prospector who once traded a single pan of silt for a hotel in Sacramento. Elijah knew better. He had seen too many men dig holes into their own graves while dreaming of cabins they'd never build. He wrote again, "There are many ways to be poor out here. One is to dig, the other is to believe." A week later, Elijah came upon a man sitting in the snow near the woods, blank-eyed, hands trembling, clutching a rolled map. Elijah crouched beside him and asked what had happened. "Paid $2, the man whispered. "Said there'd be gold. Walked 3 days, found nothing but rocks and bones." Elijah took the map. It was vague, smudged with water. A few mountains sketched. A river maybe. No markers, no truth. Another lie sold in parchment. He folded it carefully and placed it in his coat pocket, unsure why. Perhaps to burn later. Perhaps as a warning. The merchants, of course, never stayed long. They came, sold, smiled, and vanished. By the time the thaw had fully come, they were already preparing to leave. Wagons a little lighter, purses far heavier. Elijah watched them go, standing among the pines as they passed. He said nothing. But one merchant paused. It was the man from Elkins and Sons. He pulled his wagon to a halt and tipped his hat toward Elijah. "You've got the look of a man who sees too much," he said with a chuckle. Elijah offered no reply. The merchant smiled wider. "If you're smart, friend, you'll trade that shovel for a pen. Sell stories. The world's always more eager to buy dreams than dirt." And with that, he rode away. Elijah stared at the tracks they left, deep cuts in the mud, curling like scars through the snow. He reached into his pack, pulled out the worthless map, and lit it with the end of a pine twig still burning from his morning fire. He watched the paper curl, blacken, and vanish. Then quietly, he spoke to no one. Dreams, sold too cheaply, become nightmares. He spent the next few days in silence. But something had changed. He began to notice not just the merchants, but the hunger they fed. Men who had nothing, giving up the little they did for stories wrapped in sugar and lies. It wasn't cruelty that had taken them. It was longing, a kind of hope too desperate to control. And Elijah understood it. He had once followed whispers across a continent. He wrote in his journal that night, "Not all thieves carry knives. Some carry smiles." And not all of us were robbed. Some of us bought the lies ourselves. It began with the wind, not the harsh, howling kind that rattled tents and stole sleep, but a softer sort, gentle and strange. It carried something with it, something hard to name, a sense of presence, of watching. Elijah had felt it before, in old churches back home, where the air hung thick with incense and memory. But here, in the vastness of the hills, it felt heavier, like the land itself remembered more than it let on. One late afternoon, while scouting for wood beyond the ridge, Elijah heard something unexpected. A voice, not loud, not urgent, but unmistakably human. It came in pulses, low, rhythmic, measured like song or prayer. He stilled at once, turning toward the sound. The trees were thicker here, branches weighed with old snow, the path narrower and hidden. He moved, carefully, each step measured. As he climbed a slope dusted in frost, the voice became clearer. It was Latin. Not the kind Elijah understood fluently, but he recognized its cadence, its deep, circular movement, like waves returning to shore. It reminded him of sermons from childhood, of dusty hymnals and the echo of a priest's voice beneath the low wood rafters of his family's small country church. At the crest of the hill, the trees parted to reveal a clearing. And in that clearing, graves. Not one, not two, but a cluster. Perhaps 20, perhaps more, marked with simple stone piles, sticks tied with cloth, or crooked wooden crosses bleached silver by snow and time. At the center, a man knelt. He was draped in a long, tattered brown robe. His hair was white, his shoulders bent, his hands clasped together tightly in prayer. The words fell from his lips steadily, as though he were reading from a script written deep in his soul. Elijah remained at the edge for a long moment, unsure if he should step forward, but something pulled him closer. Not fear, not even curiosity, but something gentler, reverence perhaps. The man did not flinch as Elijah approached. Finally the chant ceased, and the figure turned. His face was worn, lined with deep furrows, but his eyes, pale blue, almost colourless, held clarity. "You've come," the man said simply, as though expecting him. "I heard you," Elijah replied. The old man nodded. Most don't. They spoke by the graves. The man introduced himself as Brother Elias, a monk once stationed in a distant mission down near San Juan Bautista, now long abandoned. He had come north during the first winter of the gold rush, not for gold, but for souls. "I thought I would preach," Elias said, gently adjusting one of the crosses, "but I quickly learned that out here, listening is the better sermon." He had stayed ever since, wandering the hills, burying the dead, reciting prayers for those no one would remember. Elijah walked among the graves in silence. Many were unmarked, others bore crude etchings, initials, dates, a cross made from nails. One had a broken spoon driven into the dirt as a headstone. They were miners, Elijah asked. "Most," Elias answered. "Others were wanderers, runaways, lost boys. No one asked their stories, and they had no one left to tell them." He motioned to the far corner of the clearing, where an old Bible lay open on a stone slab, its pages fluttering lightly in the breeze. I read over them, not because I believe it saves them, but because it honors the sound of their lives. They spoke until the sun fell behind the ridge. Elijah told Elias about his own efforts to remember the lost, about the stones he'd carved with names, the letter. He'd floated down the river, the voice in his head that refused to let him forget. The monk listened, eyes fixed on the horizon. "That's what keeps the hills alive," he said. "Not the gold, the remembering." Before Elijah left, Elias handed him a small wooden cross, carved from oak, bound with twine. "For your fire," he said with a smile. "Not to burn, but to anchor." Elijah placed it in his coat pocket. He walked back to camp slowly as the stars kindled in the cold dusk. That night, he placed the cross beside his fire pit and boiled tea over a quiet flame. Sleep came gently, and in the morning, for the first time in many weeks, he sang softly to himself as he folded his blanket. He returned to the clearing days later, carrying with him a bundle of cloth and a few nails. He helped Elias fix one of the collapsing markers. They shared stew. They shared silence. But when he returned the third time, the monk was gone. No sign, no footsteps. Only the Bible, closed now, with a pine cone laid atop it. Elijah sat there a long time. Then he opened the book to the last page Elias had read. The verse was from Psalms. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. He determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name. Elijah underlined the final words with the corner of a nail, calls them each by name. That evening, as shadows spilled across the hills, Elijah read aloud from the book, not for salvation, not even for the dead, but so the hills would remember the names. And so, a choice took root. On that morning, Elijah rose slowly, wrapped in his patched blanket, his fingers stiff with cold and his breath rising in curls of frost. His fire had burned low in the night, but still smouldered beneath a bed of ash. The wind outside his tent rustled the canvas like a voice too old to shape words. Normally he would rise, reach for his pan, his shovel, his small sack. The motions were habit now, automatic. He had performed them hundreds of times, like a ritual spoken with no memory of its meaning. But this morning, his hand did not reach for the pan. He simply sat. He wrapped his hands around a tin cup of pine, needle tea, warmed it over the flickering coals, and stared out into the pale blue hush of morning. Just for today, he would not dig. He had decided this quietly the night before. The thought barely formed, more a whisper than a conviction. But now in the pale light of dawn, it felt whole. It felt right. He would live the day, not as a miner chasing illusions, but as a man who once planted corn in spring and read poems by lantern light. A man who still dreamed, not of riches, but of stillness. The forest around him had begun to soften. Though patches of snow clung to the shadows, small shoots of green pushed through the thawing soil. The river, once gripped tight in winter's jaw, now moved more freely, its icy skin broken into ribbons of cold blue light. He walked, without purpose. His boots squelched in the mud, and the air carried a damp scent of moss and last year's pine needles. The silence was not empty. Birds trilled from the canopy. Branches creaked above. A squirrel darted across his path with a piece of dry bark in its mouth. He wandered uphill, through a thicket of bare dogwood trees, and came to a low ridge where the wind played gently through the stone. There he sat, and for a long time he did nothing. No digging, no weighing, no calculating the worth of what might lie beneath his feet. Just breath, just earth, just the simple reality of being present. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the little wooden cross Brother Elias had given him. He placed it in the soil beside him, upright between two stones. A token, a marker, a reminder. He stayed there until the sun climbed higher and the wind warmed slightly. Returning to camp, he gathered water from the stream, then kindled a fire and cooked a small meal. Lentils, with salt, a scrap of cured meat, and a pinch of wild thyme he had dried weeks before. He ate slowly, chewing each bite with care, listening to the fire crackle like an old friend telling stories. Afterward, he sorted through his things. Not the gold, not the gear, but the smaller things. The The folded letters, the smooth river stones with names carved by nail, the worn journal with pages stained by time and ash. He read passages aloud to no one in particular. A line from an earlier entry caught his eye. Some dig for gold, others dig for silence. I am still learning the difference. He underlined it. Then, on a blank page, he wrote, "Today, I dug nothing, but I did not feel empty. I watched clouds drift like sails across the sky. I listened to the language of birds. I remembered the feel of home, not as a place, but a rhythm, a slower rhythm than this place allows." He closed the journal and leaned back. A breeze passed gently through the trees, carrying the scent of earth, clean and full of promise. As evening neared, he walked to the riverbank and sat upon a log, smoothed by years of current and time. He removed his boots and placed his feet in the water. It was cold, bracing, and real. The sensation pulled him into the moment more surely than any prayer. When the sky turned to copper and shadows stretched long and lean across the forest floor, Elijah lit 2 small fires, one for warmth and another, smaller one, a ceremonial hearth near the wooden cross. He laid sage across it and watched as the smoke rose in twisting threads. There were no prayers spoken, but something was heard. Within that quiet moment, Elijah felt something shift, not in the world, but within himself. A loosening, a letting go. He did not need to return to digging tomorrow, but he might. He had not found gold today, but he had found breath, and sometimes that was the more precious metal. That night, he slept without waking. His dreams were soft, filled with wheat fields and familiar voices. He saw Anna again, running down the hill behind their house, laughing, her braids flying like pennants. He saw his mother at the stove, humming. He saw Jedediah Black sitting beside a campfire, eyes warm, quoting poetry with his flask in hand, and, when he woke, long after sunrise, the fire had burned low again. But his heart was steady. He sat up slowly, stretched his back, and reached once more for his tin cup. And before even considering the shovel or pan, he looked skyward and whispered, "To the morning, thank you." And so it did. It began with a visitor. A figure approached camp just after dawn, lean, dusty, draped in a canvas coat stiff with travel. His beard was trimmed, but his eyes were sunken and sharp. He carried a rifle slung over one shoulder and a satchel heavy with clinking contents. Elijah had heard his boots long before the man spoke. "You Elijah Ward?" the stranger asked. "I am," Elijah answered carefully. The man grinned, revealing yellow teeth. "Name's Rook. Heard you were one of the few still getting flakes out of this godforsaken valley." Elijah said nothing. Rook continued, dropping his satchel to the dirt. "I've got something for you. Trade, if you're willing. Something better than beans and bullets." From the bag, he drew a weathered map, creased, smudged, edges torn, but drawn in fine hand with ink that had once been bold. "It's old," Rook said, tapping the corner, "but true. This trail leads to a gulch 3 ridges east. Never picked, never staked. Old Spanish gold, some say." Elijah looked at it. The paper crackled as Rook unfolded it. It showed a stream, a ridge, a hollow marked with a red cross. He had seen such maps before, sold by desperate merchants, whispered over dying fires. Most were worthless, but something about this one lingered. The detail, the names, the inked elevation marks. "What do you want for it?" Elijah asked finally. Rook shrugged. 2 nuggets, or your compass." Elijah frowned. "Why the compass?" "Because it works," Rook said simply, "and I'm tired of walking in circles." Elijah hesitated, then reached into his pack and pulled the compass free. It was old, brass, scratched, but true. He'd used it since leaving Missouri. It had never failed him. He weighed it in his hand, then traded it. Rook nodded, tucked it into his coat, and left without another word. Elijah studied the map again long after the stranger had disappeared. He wasn't sure why he believed it. Perhaps he didn't. But something in him stirred. An old ache. Not greed, not even hope. Just the need to move, to try, to see if something still waited out there. By noon, he packed. Just enough supplies for 3 days. His shovel, his pan, a blanket and dried meat, a canteen, and the map. He left the wooden cross standing by the fire, his tent half folded in case the wind turned, and stepped into the eastward woods, heart steady, feet unsure. The first day went well enough. The trail on the map matched what he saw, the split oak, the stony outcrop, the hollow where creek water shimmered faintly beneath the trees. He moved quietly, marking his path with cuts in bark, stacking small stones as he'd once seen Jed do. But by the second morning, something felt wrong. The ridges no longer matched. The stream forked unexpectedly. A hill that should have risen gently climbed steep and jagged. Elijah checked the map again and again, turned it sideways upside down. Still nothing aligned. He reached for the compass, out of habit. But it was gone. Rook had it now. He stared at the sun, tried to judge direction by light. But clouds had moved in, thick, low, the colour of cold pewter. By dusk, he was lost. No trail, no creek, no red cross on a hill, only trees, only silence. He built a small fire and sat beside it, trying to retrace his steps in his mind. But memory shifted like mist. Was that ridge behind him or ahead? Did he turn left at the split pine, or right? He dreamed of spinning, of walking in circles through fog that whispered his name. On the third morning, his firewood was damp and his hands too cold to hold the flint steady. The fire took an hour to catch. His canteen was half empty, his food nearly gone. He unfolded the map again. It made less sense now than ever. The lines were just lines, the cross just a mark. The paper trembled in the breeze. He felt something then, a mix of anger, shame, and quiet fear. Not of dying exactly, but of fading, of becoming one more man who walked too far chasing a lie. By evening, the snow returned, light flurry at first, then thicker. The sky closed in. The trees disappeared behind veils of white. Elijah huddled beneath a cedar, wrapping his blanket tight, whispering to himself to stay awake. He thought of his sister, of the Ridge boys, of Jed and brother Elias, and then he thought of the compass, its steady needle, its honest silence. How foolish, he thought, to trade truth for direction drawn in ink. When morning came, he could barely feel his legs, but he moved. One step, then another, not guided by map, but by instinct. He watched the sky, followed the slope of the land, listened for water, and just before dusk, he saw it, a flicker of smoke curling upward from behind a distant ridge. His camp. He nearly collapsed from the relief. The fire still stood. The cross still leaned beside it. He dropped to his knees and cried, then laughed, then lit the fire again. He didn't touch the shovel that night, or the pan, or the map. He only sat, warmed his hands, and whispered. Even a broken compass tells the truth by its absence. He never saw Rook again. But he never forgot what that trade had cost him, and from that day on, he trusted maps a little less, and silence a little more. That is how Elijah came, at last, to the saloon. It was not a saloon in the way you might imagine. No polished wood, no grand staircase or piano. Just a canvas stretched over 4 pine posts, patched with old flour sacks and dyed with tobacco, smoke. A plank bar nailed across whiskey crates, oil lamps dangling from strings, and inside, men. Men who had once been dreamers. Now, they were only quiet, grim, and grey-eyed. Elijah had heard their voices many nights from afar, the hoarse laughter, The clink of tin cups, the broken singing that slipped into the trees like forgotten prayers. He had stayed away, proudly, for a time. But that night, something inside him gave way. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small softness, like frost melting beneath a boot. He stepped into the lamplight without a word. No one looked up. He took a seat in the corner and laid down 2 flakes of gold. The barkeep, an older man with one eye and 1,000-yard stare, slid a tin cup across the table. It was filled with whiskey that smelled like dust and fire. Elijah lifted it slowly. His hand trembled, only slightly. The first sip burned. The second, less so. By the third, the corners of the room softened. The air felt warmer. The ache in his ribs from weeks of cold and silence eased. Just a touch. Around him, the stories flowed. One man claimed he'd found a gold nugget the size of a hen's egg, but dropped it in the river before he could bank it. Another whispered of a canyon to the north filled with Spanish silver. No one believed anyone, and no one cared. There was comfort in that. No truth, but no demand for it either. Elijah drank slowly, staring at the oil lamp above the bar. The flame danced in its tiny glass cage, flickering with each shift of the canvas roof. He left late, later than he meant to. The whiskey had warmed his blood, made his legs loose. The night air slapped him as he stepped outside, but not hard, enough to bring clarity. Back at camp, he didn't light the fire. He fell into his bedroll, boots still on, and slept hard. In the morning, his mouth was dry, his head dull, but not ruined. He boiled water and drank it in slow sips, hands shaking only a little. He told himself it had helped. That evening, he went back. The second night was easier, the third almost habitual. He didn't speak, just listened, just drank. It wasn't about forgetting, not exactly. It was about dulling, softening the sharp edges of his mind, so the memories wouldn't cut so deep. The Ridge Boys, Jed, Brother Elias, Anna, his mother's hands in flour, his father's last words on the doorstep. They all blurred in whiskey light. The digging slowed. Some days, he didn't dig at all. He still kept the fire, still boiled tea, but his journal remained shut. His pan stayed cold, and the stones he once carved names into now gathered snow unchecked. Then came the night he drank too much, far too much. The saloon was louder than usual. A trader had arrived with a crate of hard cider, and the miners were rowdy. One was shouting verses from the Bible, another banging rhythm on the table with his cup. Elijah drank quickly, then slowly, then not at all. He sat, slumped against the wall, vision swimming, the tent spinning, like a river current. When he finally stumbled outside, the cold hit him hard. He collapsed in the snow near a stump, retched until his chest ached, and lay there gasping. A stranger passed, young, his coat too thin. He looked down at Elijah and muttered, "You all right, old man?" Elijah didn't answer, didn't have the words, only nodded weakly. When he awoke, the stars had shifted. The moon was nearly down. Frost clung to his beard. His hands were numb, and still, he returned to his tent. He lit the fire with stiff fingers. He boiled snow into water, and as the flames grew, he opened his journal. It had been over a week since he'd last written. His script was jagged, uncertain. I thought whiskey would carry the weight, but it only wears different shoes. It walks beside me now, not behind, and I don't want that anymore. I want silence again, but not the silence of numbness, the silence of waking before the dawn, of pine trees shifting in their sleep, that kind of quiet. He closed the book, added more wood to the fire, and pulled the small wooden cross from beneath his blanket. He stared at it, then placed it beside the fire once more, upright, steady. That night, he didn't drink, nor the night after. He ate plain food. He dug slowly, not to find gold, but to feel the dirt again, the cold, the water, the work. And when he looked at the bottle kettle in his pack, half full, sealed with cloth and wax. He didn't open it. He carried it to the river, set it gently in the current, watched it drift. He whispered as it floated away, "Let me feel it all." Again, even the pain, especially the pain. Because pain, as Elijah now knew, was proof of being alive. And in a place where so many had vanished, that meant something. That morning began like many others. The embers still glowed faintly beneath the ashes. The sky was a pale sheet of light, not yet ripened into color. Elijah stirred beneath his blanket, rising slowly with the measured groan of a man used to cold, joints, and empty hours. He stepped from the tent into the grey dawn, kettle in hand, and noticed it at once. The world had stopped singing. There was no wind, no birds, no sound of the creek's ripple, which usually hummed its quiet song across. The rocks, even the trees, which in springtime should have rustled with renewed life, stood stiff and silent, like sentries in mourning. Elijah froze. It was the kind of silence that didn't feel natural, the kind that made the hair on his arms rise without cold. He reached for the kettle without looking, fingers brushing metal, but his eyes remained fixed on the edge of the woods, on the absolute stillness of the pine boughs. Not even the smoke from last night's fire moved. It rose in a single straight line, like a warning. He made tea anyway. He sat with it, not drinking, just holding the warmth in his hands as if it were the only thing left alive. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed behind a pale shroud of haze, neither cloud nor fog, just a film, thin as breath on glass, that dulled the light and gave the world a flat, uneasy tone. He walked to the river. Its surface, usually restless and silvered, had turned sluggish. The water flowed, but muted, its clarity replaced by a faint murkiness, like silt stirred from the riverbed. He bent down, touched the water. It felt normal, but it looked older. He returned to camp and dug for an hour, but the earth felt strange beneath his shovel, wet in places it shouldn't be, dry in others. The texture was loose, crumbling. His pan brought up nothing but grey, clumped soil, streaked faintly with something black. He tossed the last panful back with a sigh and sat on a log, staring at his boots. Then, slowly, he began to listen again. Still no birds. Still no wind. Still no sign of movement beyond the reach of his own breath. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was a kind of waiting. That afternoon, he climbed the ridge above camp. It was a place he hadn't visited in weeks. The path was half hidden now, overgrown in places, but he moved through it with the ease of familiarity. At the top, he looked out over the valley, the camp, the river, the distant scar where the old trail vanished into forgotten hills. Everything was exactly where it should be, and yet it all felt thinner, like a memory, like a painting left too long in the sun. He sat there until the light began to dim. Then he spoke aloud, softly, as if not to disturb the quiet. "It's not just me, is it?" No answer. Just a single breath of wind that passed once through the trees, then was gone again. That night, he lit the fire not for warmth, but for companionship. The flame danced, low and nervous. Elijah sat beside it with his journal, staring at the blank page as if it might speak first. Eventually he wrote, "The world is holding its breath, not in fear, but in preparation. I feel it in the soil, in the water, in the trees that will not bend. Something is about to give. This is not a silence born of peace. It is a silence born of weight, of something old shifting beneath the surface." He set the journal down, wrapped his coat tighter, and waited. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was filled with strange dreams, of trees with hollow trunks that whispered his name, of hills that cracked open like eggs, spilling water and ash into the sky. He woke before dawn, sat outside his tent and listened. Nothing. And then, just before the first light touched the ridge, he heard it, a sound so faint it could have been imagined. A groan. Low, deep, as though the earth itself had shifted in its sleep. He stood slowly, eyes scanning the horizon, heart steady but awake. Then, without looking back, he said aloud, "I'm still here." And behind him, the fire flared once, then stilled. The silence was ending, but not in a whisper, in something older than words. It began with a sound that wasn't quite a sound. A vibration. Subtle, like the moment a string pulls taut just before it snaps. Elijah had been kneeling beside the stream, washing his hands after a morning's pan that yielded nothing. He had taken to washing not only for cleanliness, but for grounding, to feel water, cold and present, move around his fingers. The wind was quiet. The trees did not move. The soil was damp with memory. And then it came, a low, deep shudder beneath his feet. He froze. The water stilled, then rippled once, upstream. The birds, what few remained, fled in a rush of feathers. He rose slowly, listened. From far up the slope came a groan, not the howl of air, but the complaint of stone. A distant crack, deep and yawning. Then silence again. But this time, it was a silence that knew something. He turned to look toward camp and the ridge behind it. That was when the earth moved. The ridgeline quivered. Trees leaned not in wind, but in warning, and then a part of the hill broke free. It did not fall. It slid, as though a door had been opened. Beneath it, soil, stone, tree trunks, centuries of weight released all at once, cascaded down the slope in a dark, thunderless tide. Elijah did not run, not yet. He watched, stunned, as his camp, his tent, his small fire, the last carved stone he had shaped only, days before, disappeared beneath a wave of mud and broken pine. Then the sound came, belated but massive, a grinding, groaning roar, the earth no longer whispering. Now it spoke. He turned and ran for the river, boots slamming through wet grass, lungs burning. He reached the edge just as the mud swept through where his fire had been, where his cross had stood, where his name had once been whispered in solitude. He leapt into the water, not deep, but swift. The cold bit into his bones as he scrambled across, water slapping against his sides, carrying silt and broken twigs. Behind him, the land kept coming. When he reached the other side, he turned. The hillside had collapsed completely. Where once there was order, stones placed with care, fire built, with routine, there was now only motionless ruin. A black tongue of earth spread from ridge to river. He collapsed onto the opposite bank, chest heaving. Then silence again, but different now, not holding its breath, but exhaling. He sat for a long time, soaked and still, eyes on the churned remains of all he had made, not mourning what was gone, just being with it. By mid-afternoon, the earth had stopped shifting. The river returned to its path, altered only slightly. He crossed back slowly, stepping between debris, brushing away mud with the reverence one offers to the dead. He found a scrap of his tent, torn and soaked. A cup. Half of the journal, miraculously still tucked in the pocket of a coat that had snagged on a stump. He held it to his chest, and then, just beside a stone washed smooth by the flood, he saw the cross, the one he had carved for brother Elias. It lay cracked, the upper limb snapped clean, but still bearing the mark of his blade. He bent, lifted it with both hands, and whispered, "You made it." He did not cry. There was no need. The land had done what it does, shifted, shed, reset. And Elijah, in his quiet way, did what he had always done. He adapted. He walked to the edge of what was once his fire pit and placed the broken cross upright. In the mud, it tilted, unbalanced, but stood. Then he opened the journal, wrote, "I lost my shelter today, but not myself. The land spoke in the language of collapse, and I listened. What I built is gone, but the hands that built it remain." He looked across the valley as twilight settled. Smoke rose far off from someone else's fire. A bird returned, just one, singing an uncertain song from a branch that had survived. Elijah smiled, barely. He would not rebuild there, not in that place, but he would not stop building. He took one last look at the scar in the earth, then turned his back to it and walked, not away but forward. This morning finds him returning, not as the man who once claimed the hillside, but as one who must learn again how to see. The sky is a dull woolen grey, draped low across the valley. Mist clings to the ground in ribbons, curling around the remnants of what used to be a camp. Elijah stands at the edge of it once more. The path back is muddy and strewn with debris, and the earth still smells freshly torn. Wet pine, crushed lichen, the dark scent of soil long hidden from light. He walks slowly, stepping between the splintered ribs of trees and stones, now cracked open like books too long closed. He does not speak. There is no need. The land speaks plenty. At his feet lies a length of canvas, its seams frayed, its fabric stiff with dried mud. Nearby, a tin plate, bent like a crescent, glints dully in the weak morning light. Each item is a memory, unearthed not by time, but by force. He kneels, brushes his fingers gently over the rim of the plate. It had once belonged to another miner, now long gone. A gift in exchange for silence one winter evening. He wraps it in cloth and places it in his sack, not for use, but remembrance. Further down, where the fire pit had been, he finds one of the stones, still warm to the touch, impossibly. He sits beside it, rests his hand upon it. The earth is not cruel, it simply is. It moves and it changes, and those who live upon it must either move with it or be buried beneath it. He closes his eyes, listens. The birds have returned, not many, but enough to say, life continues. He smiles faintly and rises, wanders further down toward the edge of the river where the debris is thicker. Here, tangled in a branch, he finds the kettle, dented, blackened, but whole. He lifts it like an old friend. It had boiled hundreds of cups of water, tea, soup, hope. He cradles it in the crook of his arm, a quiet weight. Near it, tucked into the curve of a tree root, he spots something unexpected. His journal. He drops to his knees, pulls it free with care. The leather cover is scuffed, the corners softened by water, but the pages within, miraculously, remain legible. He flips through them slowly. His own handwriting greets him like a voice in a long hallway. Each word, each phrase, a trail of footprints he had left behind. He turns to a blank page, pauses, then writes, "I have returned, not to reclaim what was lost, but to remember what remains. Among the broken things, I have found pieces not of gold, but of self. The land did not bury me. It opened me." He closes the book, places it gently in his sack. Then, as the mist lifts slightly, he sees something half buried at the foot of a fallen tree. A bundle wrapped in linen, his father's harmonica. It is soaked, the metal dulled, but when he lifts it to his lips and blows, a single note emerges, thin, uncertain, but real, and that is enough. He plays a second note, then a third. The melody is not beautiful, but honest. It fills the space between broken limbs and upturned stones with something human, something defiant in its softness. He walks now, slowly, cradling the harmonica in one hand, the kettle in the other. The cross is still there, snapped in, too, but standing, crooked in the muck. He stands before it for a long time, then kneels, plants the kettle at its base, places the harmonica beside it, and whispers, not an altar, but a place to begin. Not the past, but what's left after it. He rises, wipes his hands on his coat, and turns his face toward the higher ground. The slope that had once loomed behind the camp now seems gentler, stripped bare by the slide. He walks toward it, feet squelching through soft earth, each step an echo of the one before. At the top, he looks down. The scar is plain, a wound across the valley floor. But beyond it, trees still stand. Water still runs. Sky still shifts, and something inside him does, too. He pulls the journal from his sack once more and writes, I am not what I buried. I am what I carry. I will not mind today. I will be. He folds the book closed, exhales, then takes the first true breath of the rest of his life. As he walked, the forest began to change. The thick scent of wet earth gave way to something sweeter. Cedar bark, wild mint, and the crisp smell of untouched leaves. Here, the trees stood taller, but with more space between them, as though giving the land room to breathe again. The sun slipped through in broken beams, golden fingers brushing the moss-covered floor. He carried no map, no destination, only a sense that somewhere ahead, a clearing waited, and in the early blush of afternoon, he found it. Not a grand place, no towering peaks or rushing river, but a modest glade nestled between birch and pine. The ground sloped gently inward, cupping a flat space where sunlight pooled like water. At the center, 3 large stones sat in a half circle, their edges softened by time and lichen. Elijah paused at its edge, felt something inside him still. Not silence, but permission. He stepped forward. The moss cushioned his steps. A bird flitted from a low branch, wings flashing white. The place did not ask for anything. It simply waited. He knelt beside one of the stones and laid his hand upon it, warm from sun, cool beneath. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in many days, did not remember what he had lost, but what he had left. He unpacked slowly, the kettle, wrapped in cloth, the harmonica, still bearing his father's initials, his journal, pages warped but intact, a folded wool blanket, each item placed carefully on the stone, like offerings. Then he stood and began gathering wood. The fire he prepared was not born of need. He was not cold. He was not cooking. He was not sending up smoke for rescue. This fire would not mark territory or hold back the dark. It would only be he found dry branches, snapped them gently, and arranged them in a tight cradle. Birch bark curled around the base. His flint sparked on the second strike. The flame came soft and slow, curling upward in a copper breath. He sat before it cross-legged, watched it grow. It warmed his hands, yes, but more than that, it warmed the moment. No plan, no profit, just flame and choice. He boiled water with mint and pine tips, breathing in the earthy steam. He sipped it slowly as the birds resumed their chatter overhead. Then he opened his journal and wrote, I did not choose this fire to mark a claim. I chose it to mark a beginning. This place has no gold beneath it, but it has something richer. Stillness, air, time that asks nothing. He closed the book, let the ink dry, and leaned back against the stone. The fire crackled gently. He took out the harmonica, lifted it to his lips, played no song, just a few wandering notes. They floated between the birch trunks, answered by wind. Not perfect, not polished, but honest. As twilight slipped across the clearing, Elijah gathered more wood and stacked it near the fire. He walked the grove's edge, noting the small things, a deer path worn into the moss, a cluster of violet blossoms at the base of an oak, a flat patch where one might one day sleep. He returned to the fire as stars began to prick the sky. Laid out his blanket, folded his coat beneath his head, and stared upward into the growing dark. The fire burned low now, but it burned true. He opened his journal one last time and wrote, "I once thought gold was the measure of a man's success. Now I think it may be this: a fire, a page, and the courage to stop running. I am not rich, I am not safe, but tonight I am here." He set the journal beside him, pulled the blanket close, and let the night take him, gently, fully, into rest. Not as a miner, not as a ghost, but as a man, beginning again. The sun rose slowly, like a lamp being lit in a quiet room. Elijah opened his eyes to birdsong, not hunger. He did not leap to his feet or reach for tools. Instead, he sat up, rubbed the sleep from his face, and looked around the clearing. The fire had gone low, barely a breath above ash, but it had not died. With a few dry twigs and careful coaxing, it returned to life. He boiled water, dropped in crushed pine, added a scrap of wild mint. As it steeped, he sat with his knees drawn close, watching steam curl into the morning. There were no plans, no chores, no musts, only a cup of warm tea, and air that asked nothing of him. He took out his journal, ran his fingers along the warped leather spine, opened to a blank page, and wrote, "I once measured value in weight, ounces, nuggets, flakes. Now I measure it in stillness. And in this moment, I feel rich." After breakfast, Elijah stood and stretched. The stiffness in his legs reminded him that while he had not labored yesterday, his body still bore the memory of years chasing soil and shimmer. He walked, not far, only a gentle loop around the clearing, hands brushing along grass tops, eyes scanning the undergrowth. The world, in its slow morning state, seemed to move with him. He found berries, dark, plump, sweet from sun, and mushrooms, familiar ones, safe ones. He took only a few, enough for today. Near a fallen tree, he found a patch of soft moss and sat upon it. Birds chirped overhead. A chipmunk darted across a log. He smiled. Not because it was remarkable, but because it wasn't. Because somehow the ordinary had become miraculous. By midday, he returned to the fire, added a few small logs, let it build not to heat food, but to continue. A rhythm, he laid the berries out on a flat stone. A small meal. Simple. Enough. While he ate, he remembered meals past, pans of beans over roaring fires, half-spoiled jerky shared with strangers in tents, crusts of bread hoarded beneath damp blankets. He remembered eating quickly, always with one eye on the pan and one on the horizon, as if the land might sneak in and take even his hunger away. But here, now, there was no such threat. Just space and peace. He picked up the harmonica after the meal, played a few notes. They weren't pretty, but they felt placed, like stones around his fire ring, each sound a marker of something he didn't need to name. In the afternoon, he explored again, this time venturing a bit farther. He found a small spring trickling over stones, cupped his hands and drank. The water was cold and clean. He laughed softly when it shocked the back of his throat. It had been too long since water surprised him, too long since anything gentle had. He walked until shadows lengthened, then returned, tended the fire once more, and sat. He took out the journal before the stars arrived. Wrote, "I did not find gold today. I did not search. But I found moss and berries and water so cold it woke something in me I thought was dead. Is that not wealth? The kind no one can tax or take." He paused. Added, "I did not earn this, but maybe I deserve it." That word, deserve, sat oddly in his mouth. He had never used it freely. So many years he had felt the world owed him nothing. Here, in this clearing, with no one watching, he allowed himself to believe it, that he deserved to breathe without chase, to eat without fear, to listen without agenda, to sleep without grief clawing at the edge of dream. As twilight turned the sky violet, he folded the journal shut. The fire burned low, but he let it. It didn't need to blaze, just remain. He pulled the blanket around his shoulders, watched stars gather in the sky like lanterns on a black sea. He whispered, not a prayer, just a truth. This is enough. And for the first time since he had stepped into the hills with a shovel and a dream, he did not wish for more. The night began gently. Elijah lay beneath his blanket, the stars above so bright they seemed closer than clouds. The fire had grown small, a patient glow beneath ash. He should have slept. He was tired, his body loose with the good fatigue of walking, gathering, writing. But something in the air, or perhaps in himself, refused rest. He turned onto his side, then his back, stared upward, and felt that strange sensation that someone else was there. He sat up slowly, looked around the clearing. Nothing stirred, but he knew. It wasn't fear, it was memory. Memory wearing the face of a man he had loved and lost. His father. It began with the sound of a cough, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. But then, clear as the whistle of a kettle, the voice came. Not through the trees, but in the air behind his ears. You always liked the night, boy, even when you were small. Elijah didn't speak. Not aloud, but the warmth in his chest swelled like response. He could see him now, not as a ghost, not with glowing eyes or misty hands, but as he truly was. Lean, weathered, a shadow against the firelight. The same coat, the same boots with one lace always trailing. He remembered a night like this, years ago when they'd camped by the Snake River. The gold had run dry, the food nearly gone, and his father, instead of worrying, had told him a story about a miner who found not gold, but a stone shaped like a heart. Elijah hadn't understood it then, but now he wondered if it had been meant for this moment. You tried so hard, Elijah whispered. So did you, the memory replied. He sat with that for a long while, until another voice came. Lighter, younger, his friend Josiah, the fool who laughed too loud, who sang to scare off bears and danced when he found a single flake. Josiah had died in a cave-in 3 years back. Elijah hadn't gone to the funeral, hadn't written to his family, hadn't known what to say. But here, now, Josiah's grin flashed in his mind's eye, and he heard again the voice. Ain't no gold worth dying for, Elijah. But it sure makes a good story. Elijah laughed softly, shook his head. You always said that. And I was always right. He took a deep breath, then a deeper one. And as he exhaled, another figure appeared, not in flesh, not in form, but in memory. Brother Elias, his quiet prayers, his trembling hands, his carved wooden cross, the man who spoke more with silence than words. Elijah remembered how Elias would sit by the fire, lips moving, eyes half closed, not asking for miracles, only meaning. He remembered the way Elias would murmur, even the dust carries truth, and tonight Elijah believed him. All around, the dust of memory stirred, not to accuse, not to ache, just to be felt, to be known, to be allowed. He reached for his harmonica, played a low, mournful tune, nothing rehearsed. Just breath passed through, metal and reed, a song for no one and for everyone. He opened his journal. The page shimmered faintly in the firelight. He wrote, Tonight the dead came close, not to haunt, but to visit. did not knock. They did not weep. They sat quietly, as they always had. He paused, then added, I did not ask them to leave. And maybe that is what healing is, when the past can sit beside you and no longer steal the present. He laid the journal down, let the fire burn as it wished, leaned back on his elbows and looked at the stars again. He thought about all he'd carried and all he'd buried, and how some things return, not to hurt, but to hold, as if saying we were real and we mattered, and that mattered still. He whispered into the dark, I remember, and I forgive. And finally, as the coals sighed into silence, Elijah lay back, not to escape sleep, but to welcome it. For the ghosts had spoken, and he had listened. The morning arrived with a hush so complete, it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. The mist drifted slowly through the trees, curling like old thoughts across the moss. Elijah rose not with urgency, but intention. He had known this. Day would come. There were no chores, no hunt for berries, no tending of fire, only this. He walked to the edge of his small camp, where the old cloth bundle lay against a tree stump, creased with time, stained with dust. He knelt, untied the knot, unfolded the fabric. There they lay, the pickaxe with its split handle, the tin pan that had once caught dreams in a shimmer of silt, and the shovel. The edge was dulled now, the wood worn smooth from years of sweat and grip. He ran a hand along the shaft. A shiver passed through him, not from cold, but from memory. This tool had been with him in the wet cold of spring, the heat of July, the dry bitterness of desert camps. It had outlasted friendships, outlasted towns, but not this moment. He slung the shovel across his shoulder and walked, north, along a quiet trail. He passed the spring where he now drew water, the tree with, the hollow that sometimes held a nesting owl. Beyond that, the edge of the grove opened to a patch of soil soft and untouched, a place that felt like an ending. He stood for a while, listening. The birds had not yet begun their morning calls. The air was damp with silence. Then, with a slow breath, Elijah drove the shovel into the earth. It met no resistance. The soil gave way. Each scoop came steady, measured, as though the land, too, understood the purpose. This was not digging to find something. This was digging to lay something to rest. When the hole was wide enough, he set the shovel down beside it. Then the pick, then the pan. He pulled from his pocket a folded page, a torn leaf from his journal, ink already dried from the night before. He read it once more before placing it inside. This tool once promised riches and delivered lessons. I carried it longer than I should have. But now I give it back, to the ground, not in defeat but in freedom. He placed the note atop the tools, then began to cover them, not quickly, not carelessly. Each scoop felt like breath, each motion, a release. When the mound was complete, he smoothed the surface with both hands, picked a flat stone from nearby, set it gently atop. No carving, no words, just presence. He sat down beside it, folded his knees to his chest, looked at the stone and remembered the sound of metal hitting gravel, the ache in his spine after long days, the strange hope that always flickered when the blade struck deep. He whispered, "You tried. I know that now. You kept me going when nothing else did. But I don't need you anymore." He closed his eyes, felt no sorrow, only softness. Back at camp, he rekindled the fire, not out of habit, but as a way of honouring the moment. The flames rose slowly, without rush. He boiled water, made tea from crushed mint and pine, drank it facing the direction of the burial site, not watching, just acknowledging. He opened his journal, wrote, "I buried the shovel today, I did not cry. I did not cheer. I simply returned it to the earth, and in doing so, I made room for something new. He closed the book. The wind picked up, moving gently through the trees. The mist began to lift. The birds began to sing. And Elijah sat, a man no longer defined by what he chased, but by what he had chosen to release. The morning broke slow and golden. The frost that had kissed the ground overnight melted softly as sunlight filtered through the birch canopy. Elijah did not rise quickly. He didn't need to. There were no carts to meet, no letters to send, no weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. When he did sit up, he stayed still for a long while. Blanket pulled close, eyes scanning the familiar line of trees. It had been months since he'd heard another human voice, and yet he no longer called that loneliness. Now, it was something else, something quieter, deeper. He rose with slow steps and stirred the fire, coaxing new life from the banked embers. The kettle went on as it always did. The mint, gathered days before, went in. He watched the steam rise in spirals, like prayers that needed no words. As the tea steeped, he opened the journal one last time. Its pages were nearly all filled, years of days marked with soil and memory, each line another layer of a man becoming something new. He found a blank space near the end and wrote, "I am not the man who came here." He was lean with want and loud with silence. "I am softer now. Not weaker, just more still." He paused, then added, "The world does not miss me, but the forest knows my name. And that is enough." After breakfast, he walked the familiar loop through his little grove. He checked the stream, clear and laughing. Not loud, but playful. He smiled. Bending down, he scooped a handful of water and let it slip through his fingers. It was cold, alive, like truth. He wandered toward the clearing where he'd buried the shovel. It was undisturbed. Moss had already begun to grow around the stone he'd placed atop the mound. Nature wastes no time in reclaiming what returns to her. He stood a long time before it, not thinking, not grieving, just acknowledging. Then, with a soft hum beneath his breath, he turned away and walked back toward camp. The fire had burned low, but there was no need to stoke it. He let it breathe. Later that afternoon, he sat with the harmonica and played, not a song, but a sound. Long, low thread of breath and brass, like wind whispering through a hollow tree. It was not beautiful in the way people meant, but it was real, and real things do not need to impress. They need only to exist. That night, Elijah prepared a small meal, roots, herbs, and a sliver of smoked meat he had saved. He ate by the firelight, slow and thankful. As he cleaned the bowl, he felt the weight of the years fall behind him, not as sorrow, but as story. Each moment, he had once thought failure had become a step toward this peace. Each name lost, each hope abandoned, had made space for something gentler to take root. He returned to the journal one final time. Wrote, "Tonight, the fire is quiet. And I'm not waiting. Not for gold, not for salvation, just for stars." He closed the book, placed it carefully in the small box beneath his cot. He would not write again. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because the rest would be lived, not recorded. He lay down as twilight deepened. The fire cracked once, then settled. Above him, the stars blinked into place. Elijah watched them through half-lidded eyes and whispered, "I stayed. And I became." He did not need a monument or a legacy or to be remembered by name, for the land had shaped him and he, in his quiet way, had shaped it back, and that, truly, was enough.